In the summer of 430 BC, the greatest city in the Greek world faced two enemies at once. Outside its walls, the Spartan army burned the farms of Attica. Inside its walls, a far deadlier enemy was already claiming its first victims. The plague of Athens didn't just kill people. It bankrupted the richest democracy in antiquity, destroyed the leadership of its greatest statesman, and set in motion a chain of economic failures that would end with Athens defeated, humiliated, and broke. This is the story of how one disease destroyed an empire's finances. Let's start with the money. Because before the plague, Athens was rich. Staggeringly rich. In the spring of 431 BC, just before the war began, the Athenian leader Pericles stood before the assembly and reviewed the city's finances. His numbers were extraordinary. Athens had 6,000 talents of coined silver sitting on the Acropolis. That's roughly 150 tons of pure silver. In addition, there were another 500 talents in uncoined gold and silver artifacts, sacred vessels, and dedications. On top of this reserve, Athens collected about 600 talents per year in tribute from its empire, the Delian League, plus additional revenue from port duties, mines, rents, and court fees. To put these numbers in perspective, the single talent could pay a skilled craftsman for 9 years of work. 6,000 talents could fund the entire Athenian navy for a decade. The Propylaea, the monumental gateway to the Acropolis, had cost around 200 talents. The Parthenon itself cost about 470 talents. Athens had enough cash to build the Parthenon 12 times over. Pericles told the Athenians not to worry. They had the money. They had the ships. They could outlast any Spartan siege. He was right about the money. He just didn't know about the plague. The plague first appeared in the port of Piraeus in May of 430 BC. Thucydides, the Athenian general and historian, caught it himself and survived. He left us a harrowing account. It started in Ethiopia, he wrote, then passed through Egypt and Libya before reaching the Greek world. Healthy people were suddenly attacked by violent heat in the head. Their eyes became red and inflamed. Their throats and tongues turned bloody, emitting a foul breath. Then came sneezing, hoarseness, a hard cough. The stomach seized up, followed by violent retching and spasms of bile. Externally, the body broke out in small pustules and ulcers. Internally, it burned so fiercely that victims could not bear even the lightest clothing. They threw themselves into rainwater tanks in desperate, unquenchable thirst. Most died on the 7th or 8th day. The disease was indiscriminate. It killed the rich in their fine houses and the poor crammed into tenements. It killed physicians fastest of all, because they had the most contact with the sick. It killed Pericles himself in the autumn of 429 BC, along with his sister and both of his legitimate sons. By the time the plague finally subsided, after 4.5 years and 3 distinct waves, somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 Athenians were dead. Roughly 1/4 of the entire population. 1 in 4. Now let's talk about what that death toll meant for the Athenian economy. First, the direct loss of productive labor. Of the adult male citizens who died, between 20,000 and 30,000 men, most were in their prime working years. These were the farmers, the merchants, the craftsmen, the rowers who powered the Athenian navy. Their sudden absence created an immediate shortfall of over 1,000 talents per year in lost economic activity. That's the equivalent of roughly $500 million in today's money, vanishing from the economy in a single year. But the losses didn't stop with wages. The plague killed 4,400 hoplites, the heavily armed infantry who formed the backbone of Athens' military, and 300 cavalrymen. These were exactly the men Athens needed most with the Spartan army ravaging Attica. Military readiness collapsed just when it was needed most. The silver mines at Laurium, which produced much of Athens' wealth, saw production plummet as miners died or fled. Trade with the empire faltered as ships sat idle with dead or dying crews. The grain shipments that fed the city, Athens imported more than half its food, became irregular and expensive as suppliers avoided the plague-ridden port. And here's the cruelest part, the plague struck precisely when Athens needed every drachma it had. The war with Sparta was expensive. The siege of Potidæa alone had already cost 2,000 talents. The Athenian navy, 200 triremes patrolling the Aegean, cost roughly 2,000 talents per year to operate. That's more than 3 times the city's annual tribute income. Even before the plague, Pericles had been forced to borrow from the sacred treasuries. In the 3 financial years leading up to his death, for 32-1, for 31-0, and 430-29, Athens borrowed over 3,800 talents from the temples of Athena and the other gods. The plague year alone saw borrowing of roughly 1,300 talents. After the plague, the borrowing accelerated. By 428 BC, with the treasury hemorrhaging and the plague still raging, Athens faced a full-blown fiscal crisis. So what did Athens do about it? The answer is, not nearly enough, and too late. First, they tried to cure the sick. This was expensive. Physicians had to be imported from other Greek cities, at premium rates, since no one wanted to come to plague-ridden Athens. Herbs and medicines had to be brought in from across the Mediterranean. Thucydides records that every possible remedy was tried, from incantations to oracles to desperate prayers in the temples. None of it worked, and all of it cost money. Second, they tried to maintain public order. The plague caused a complete breakdown of social norms. Thucydides writes that men abandoned all pretense of honor, spending their money recklessly because they expected to die at any moment. Property changed hands chaotically as the wealthy died and their estates passed to distant relatives or opportunistic strangers. The legal system collapsed. Why bother with lawsuits when everyone involved might be dead next week? This wasn't just a health crisis. It was a governance crisis. Third, Athens tried to keep fighting the war. The navy still sailed. The tribute collectors still went out. Thucydides mentions a squadron of 6 ships sent to collect money from Caria and Lycia in the autumn of 430, right in the middle of the worst of the plague. A larger force of 30 ships and 1,200 hoplites was mobilized to ensure the tribute kept flowing. Athens needed the money, and it would send armed men to get it, plague or no plague. But the allies noticed Athens was weak. In 428 BC, the wealthy city of Mytilene on Lesbos revolted. The suppression cost another fortune. And when Mytilene fell, the Athenians, facing a desperate cash shortage, made a fateful decision. Instead of imposing tribute, they divided the land among Athenian citizens. Short-term relief for individual Athenians, long-term disaster for the state treasury. The single greatest economic blow of the plague was the death of Pericles himself. Pericles had been the architect of Athens' financial strategy. He was the one who understood that Athens could win a defensive war by outlasting Sparta financially. He had overseen the accumulation of the Acropolis reserve. He knew exactly how much the city had and how much it could spend. When Pericles died in the autumn of 429 BC, that strategic vision died with him. The leaders who followed, Cleon, Nicias, Alcibiades, were brilliant in their own ways, but none had Pericles' grasp of financial discipline. War spending became erratic. Tribute rates were raised, then raised again, alienating the allies. The sacred treasuries were drained further. What had once been a carefully managed war fund became a grab bag for whatever emergency arose next. By 425 BC, Athens had borrowed nearly 5,600 talents from the temples, with accumulated interest pushing the total owed past 7,000 talents. That's more than the entire Acropolis reserve Pericles had boasted of just 6 years earlier. And here's a number that will shock you: Athens never repaid those loans. Not fully. The treasure of Athena, which had taken decades to accumulate, was essentially gone. The plague finally ended around 426 BC. But Athens never fully recovered. The city limped through another decade of war before a fragile peace in 421 BC. But the financial damage was permanent. The old empire, with its steady tribute payments, was crumbling. Allies who had once eagerly paid for protection from Persia now saw Athens as a desperate predator, shaking them down for cash. The sacred treasuries that had once bulged with accumulated wealth were hollowed out. The Parthenon, which had been built as a monument to Athenian power and the favor of the gods, now stood as a reminder that the gods had abandoned them. By 415 BC, when Athens launched the Sicilian expedition, the disastrous campaign that would finally break the city, the financial picture was dire. The expedition cost roughly 3,000 talents. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to capture new wealth in Sicily because the old sources had dried up. It failed catastrophically. Every ship lost. Every soldier killed or enslaved. Every drachma gone. Athens surrendered in 404 BC. The city walls were torn down. The empire was dissolved. The treasury was empty. Thucydides, looking back on the plague decades later, drew a direct line between the disease and the fall. The plague, he wrote, did more harm to Athens than any other single cause in the war. The plague of Athens is not just a story of mass death. It's a case study in how a public health crisis can destroy a nation's finances. Athens entered the war with 6,000 talents in reserve and a disciplined economic strategy. After the plague, it had debt, chaos, and leaders who didn't understand money. The disease didn't just kill a quarter of the population, it killed the economic and political system that had made Athens great. There are lessons here that echo across 25 centuries. A society that spends everything it has fighting an external threat can survive. A society that faces a simultaneous public health crisis and a war rarely does. The plague didn't just break Athens' budget. It broke Athens' immune system, in every sense of the word. The richest city in Greece could withstand the Spartans. It couldn't withstand the cost of trying to stay alive.